All right, welcome to the first Gorgias Module. This is Socrates and Callicles because they are the main characters in this text.
Yep.
Socrates, as we know, is taking the stance that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And Callicles is taking the opposite stance, which is the more hedonistic stance, that it's better to just enjoy life and it's better to be a criminal than to have crimes committed against you.
Right.
So this is just a very quick recap on what the Socratic method is. What you'll notice in the text, I thought this was mentioning, is that obviously Socrates, the Socratic method is the method of questioning in order to find answers. And you'll notice that, as we know, Socrates uses a bit of a tricking method. Like he'll pose questions that eventually get his interlocutor to admit that he's wrong, or like change his perspective on something. Because
Okay, so the person he's talking with to admit they're wrong.
Yeah. So he uses questioning to expose the other person's contradictions in their argument and therefore get them to agree with him. So the section of the text that we're about to explain is the section that focuses on natural right. Callicles has an argument about natural right, and Socrates kind of undermines that argument through his questioning.
Okay.
So this slide is just kind of the preamble before that section of the text, and Socrates is saying the reasons why he's chosen Callicles as the person to have this debate with. He wants someone who has three qualities: knowledge, affection, and candour. So he wants the person to be intelligent. He wants the person to have affection towards him, like to be his friend, and he also wants them to be honest. That's what candour means, honesty.
I think a good example of that is in the early part of the text that we looked at in class. If you remember, Callicles was like ripping into poor old Socrates.
That's his candour.
Yeah, that is definitely his candour.
Yeah,
but saying how much he loved him and appreciated him, but being like, look, I got to be upfront with you.
So Socrates actually talks about it as like a touchstone, which I'm not sure the exact definition of a touchstone. I think it's used to test whether gold is real.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So Callicles is like his touchstone, because if Socrates can convince Callicles of something, due to Callicles having these three qualities, Socrates will know that he has truly been accurate in his reasoning, because Callicles isn't going to just roll over, much like maybe Simmias or Cebes would have in the Phaedo text that we studied. Okay. He's actually going to say when he thinks Socrates is wrong.
Yeah.
And then Socrates, in the second dot point, introduces some of the key questions that this text is concerned with, which are: what sort of a person should one be? This is one of the key questions of ethics, which is kind of the
idea of the good life.
Yeah, the big theme that we're studying at the moment. What sort of a person should one be, and what should a person do with his life? The attempt to find answers to these questions is the finest work in the world. I like that. I thought that was very...
Yeah.
Yay for philosophy.
Yes, but as we will know, Callicles has previously mounted quite an attack on philosophy. So...
All right, here are two key terms that you need to know for this next section of text. Nature, or physis, and convention, or nomos. Cool. So convention, I think, is easier to define. Convention means what society thinks is morally correct. What's an example of a convention? Like, maybe like sitting up. I was going to say like sitting up at the dinner table, or using your knife and fork, or something like that. It's a convention. Like, who cares really if you use your knife and fork? But it's just something that society tells you should do.
Yeah.
Whereas nature is like what is actually correct fundamentally, like in the natural world, what is really right and wrong naturally. So the assumption is that nature is the one we should be trusting. Convention is just what people say, but it's not necessarily true. So when we're trying to find the truth about things, we should be trying to find what is naturally correct. Would you agree?
Yeah, and what we've looked at in class is that how they're opposing each other. Nature
and convention will always be opposed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so here Socrates gets Callicles to explain a point that he's previously brought up, which is Callicles' point about natural right. Socrates, in this quote, is getting Callicles to explain what he means by natural right. And Socrates takes a guess at what he thinks, which it turns out, is what Callicles thinks about natural right. Natural right, according to Callicles, is the forcible seizure of property belonging to inferior people by anyone who is superior, the dominance of the worse by the better, and the unequal distribution of goods so that the elite have more than second-rate people. So the better people having more. This is very, very similar to what Nietzsche talks about. So keep this in mind. This is a similarity between Callicles and Nietzsche.
Yeah.
They both think that the better people should just have what they want and dominate the worse people.
Yeah.
And that's what they mean by natural right.
And you'll notice, sorry, just a little tangent, but you'll notice that in the text where there's those italic sections, which are little explanations and summaries and stuff, there is a few mentions of Nietzsche attacking Callicles.
Nietzschean individualism
beliefs.
or something like that.
And that's what it is.
So the whole bit that is coming up, Socrates basically questions Callicles until he changes his definition of what superior is. So Callicles, it seems, doesn't have a clear definition of what superior means. So here, Socrates is saying, how do you define superior? And Callicles says that superior, stronger, and better are synonyms. So when he says superior, he kind of means stronger, which is why I have a picture of a strong, muscly man.
Cool.
Now, Socrates is about to kind of trick or, cleverly question Callicles until he admits that stronger can't actually be a synonym for better, right? So Socrates says, well, isn't it natural for the general populace, which means the greater amount of people, the masses, isn't it natural for the masses to be superior to a single individual? And the implication here is that, well, more people are going to be stronger than a single person. So therefore, according to Callicles' definition, that better means stronger or superior means stronger, the masses are going to be stronger and therefore superior to a single person. And so Socrates says, oh, okay then, so the masses are stronger than a single individual. So according to your reasoning, Callicles, wouldn't that mean that any rule or regulation set or prescribed by the majority of people is actually being prescribed by a superior group because they're a stronger group to any one individual? So, in other words, if Socrates is saying, well, according to your logic, Callicles, any rule set by a large number of people is actually going to be a better rule or a rule that should be followed more than a rule set by a single person. Can you see how this is going to be like a bit difficult for Callicles to get around?
Yeah.
Because Callicles thinks that one person, if they're superior, should actually set the rules for the majority of people.
Yeah.
But Socrates is showing how the opposite is kind of true.
Yeah, based on Callicles' deficient definition of superior.
Yep, which forces Callicles to change his definition of superior.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Socrates sums up here at the bottom by saying, okay, so therefore, from the standpoint of nature, as opposed to just convention, so what is actually naturally true is that the rules or regulations given by the masses are good regulations because they're prescribed by superior people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before I explain exactly what this slide is saying, I want to tell you about this rule that the masses have given. Socrates is saying, and I don't know, tell me if you agree, Tim, but Socrates is saying here that if you ask the majority of people in society, they would say, or the rule that they would set is that we should distribute things equally between people so that we shouldn't have a situation where some people have heaps more than others.
Well, it's a communist argument.
Well, it's debatable. Like, probably not everyone would say that, but Socrates...
Contrary to a capitalist society,
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
based on
Yeah.
individual interests and
So maybe that's a faulty premise in
Yeah.
Socrates' argument, but he's just assuming that most people would say
yeah.
equal distribution is better, and also that doing wrong is more contemptible. Contemptible means worse. Doing wrong is worse than suffering wrong, as in it's worse to, for example, hurt someone than to be hurt yourself. He's saying that most people in society
Callicles just agree
would say
to
that. Well, he agrees that that's what the majority would say.
Okay. Yeah.
And then Socrates just puts the nail in the coffin and says, well, that means that according to your own logic, Callicles, those statements must be correct because the masses, which are stronger and therefore superior to an individual, have set those rules. Therefore, according to nature, they must be correct, not just according to convention. Yeah?
Okay.
You don't seem convinced.
No.
So, obviously, Callicles doesn't want to accept this reasoning from Socrates. He doesn't want to accept that it's naturally correct and not just a convention, that we should distribute things equally and that it's worse to commit wrong than to suffer wrong.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to accept that, so Callicles is forced to change his definition of superior. It can't mean stronger, because if it did mean stronger, what the masses say would be considered correct according to nature. So he changes it and he says, oh, okay, well, actually, when I said superior, I meant those with greater cleverness. And that's why there's a picture of Albert Einstein there. So, and he says natural right is for an individual who is better, in other words, more clever, to rule over second-rate people, so not so clever people, and have more than them. So he's got a new definition of superior. So then Socrates comes in and rebuts this definition. And he uses a few different examples here. The first one he uses is the example of a doctor. And for some reason, he's treating doctor as a synonym with dietitian. Yeah, it's weird and like archaic, but I guess that's what it was back in ancient Greek times. So a dietitian is someone who talks about food, knows a lot about food. Apparently it's the same.
Doctor knows a lot about food.
Yeah, I know, but it's not the only thing a doctor does, so I thought it was a bit strange. But so the first example that he gives as a counter-argument to Callicles' definition of superior as clever is this doctor example. Then on the next slide he's going to give a cobbler and a coat maker and something else. So anyway, so he says, imagine we're all having a dinner party, right? Ancient Greek dinner party. And at this dinner party, there's a doctor. Won't that doctor be a better dietitian? In other words, won't he be cleverer when it comes to talking about food? Would you agree? Well, Callicles agrees. Socrates says, well, according to your reasoning, Callicles, just because this doctor is cleverer about food, that would mean that he should have more food.
Okay.
Yeah? But Socrates makes these points in the second and third dot points. Surely that's not appropriate just for the doctor to get more food just because he knows more about it. Wouldn't it be more appropriate for him to use his position of authority to distribute the food rather than squandering, in other words, wasting it on himself? And he actually says if he just fed himself with all the food, yes, he'd get more, but he'd actually also suffer for it. So it wouldn't even be good for him to keep all that food to himself. So Callicles offers a bit of a kind of half-hearted rebuttal here. He says, well, your example is stupid because a better person, yes, ought to have more, but not more food and drink. Like, why are we focusing on food and drink here so much? So then Socrates goes off on a tangent with all these other examples, not just to do with food and drink, but to do with coats, shoes, and grain. So he says, okay, what about a weaver? He would be more knowledgeable and cleverer about coats. So should he have more coats? And what about a shoemaker or a cobbler? You need to know the term cobbler. It's a synonym for shoemaker. Would a shoemaker have to walk around wearing larger shoes than anyone else and more of them? just because he knows more about them. And same thing with a farmer and grain. Would he have more grain? And actually, this is a cool thing that you should know. The type of argument that Socrates is employing here is called a reductio ad absurdum. I will give you the spelling of that at some point, and so will Timmy. But what that translates as is reducing an argument to absurdity. So what Socrates is doing is showing examples of where if you follow Callicles' reasoning, you get absurd or ridiculous consequences. And therefore, if an argument leads to absurd consequences, it can't be sound.
Yeah. And the argument of Callicles is that he's had to move his stronger of a superior person to that of somebody who is clever or knows more about stuff. And that's then what Socrates is reducing to absurdity, saying, well, if a dietitian will know more about food or drink, or a weaver will know more about coats, or a shoemaker more about shoes, so does that mean they have more of that?
Yeah. Finally, Callicles is forced to admit that this definition of superior as cleverer also doesn't make sense, because it would lead to these absurd consequences.
Yeah.
So he makes a final change to his definition of superior, and he says, okay, well, fine, the superior people I mean aren't shoemakers or cooks or any of these clever people. Above all, I'm thinking of people who have applied their cleverness to politics and thought about how to run their community well. And then he adds this part, but cleverness is only part of it. They also have courage, which enables them to see their policies through to the finish. So now he's changed his definition of superior to mean basically politicians, specifically politicians who are courageous.
Right.
Yep, so there's a little politician here.
Of that?
So he thinks that the superior people are politicians.
Yeah. And they have the right to dominate the weak. So they have the right to have their say and to do what they want. And
to have more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Go politicians.